All right, I think that we dive on in.
All right, passing it to you.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Hope the break was a wonderful moment to take a nice deep breath as we dive into our next discussion led by a really incredible speaker. I am Eliada Griffin L. I am a new member of the Apache board, really excited because I feel like I have found my pupils, and it's great to be amongst really forward-thinking international education advocates. I'm an associate professor of management at the School of Business of Robert Morris University, as well as the director of their Massey Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. In my time there, I've enjoyed focusing my research and teaching on the world of entrepreneurship and innovation, how individuals across the globe use entrepreneurial tools to build a more inclusive economy and society, and how innovation is also kind of reworking and reimagining how we are understanding global. And so after 6 years as a professor of social innovation and entrepreneurship at the University of Cape Town, in South Africa, right after leaving University of Pittsburgh with my PhD. I am now back here in Pennsylvania at Robert Morris University with hopes of being the child of West African immigrants, continuing that, that work of building global bridges. And so it is with that excitement that I introduce to you our next speaker, Dr. Ajay Nair, a great leader who is also bringing the multiplicity of his cultural identity into the work that he is doing. He is a nationally recognized expert in student affairs and an accomplished social justice, race, and ethnicity scholar. And he assumed office of Arcadia University April 2nd, 2018. He is, and we celebrate this, he is the first person of color to be appointed to be president of Arcadia. And he is among the first college or university presidents of Indian American descent across the nation, across the United States. He leads a community of 4,000 undergraduate and graduate students who are committed to liberal arts education, and I also add a leader in global education. His own research includes quality assurance in educational systems, service learning and civic engagement, and second generation Asian American identity. He has held executive leadership across a variety of universities, including the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, and the University of Virginia. And he has also taught at the World Language Institute in Gwangju, South Korea. He earned a Doctor of Philosophy and a Bachelor of Science from Pennsylvania State University. And he is married to Payal Nair, a school psychologist and graduate of Pennsylvania State University and the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. And both of them are proud parents of a son, Krishna Nair, and a daughter, Rani Nair. Dr. Nair, it is so great to have you. The floor is yours. Welcome to Apache.
Eliada, thank you so much for that introduction. As a kind and generous introduction, I appreciate it. And I look forward to getting to know you even better. Welcome back to the States, and excited to hear about all the good work that you'll continue to do. It's great to be with all of you. Thank you to the Pacey colleagues for inviting me. We were just listening to the Titanic theme song. I'm not sure how I can follow Leo and Kate. Suzanne, that was a wonderful story, by the way. I'm actually a little teary-eyed because we listened to Celine Dion not once, but twice. So I will try to hold it together and hold back the tears. Greetings from Arcadia University in Glenside, Pennsylvania. As you probably know, it's right outside Philadelphia. It seems fitting that I'm speaking to you today, given Arcadia's global impact and presence, and my own personal narrative that has roots in Philadelphia and India. And that's actually the frame for my talk today. I also wanted to just mention, I think I have at least a few colleagues from Arcadia on the Zoom call today. I think I saw Cheryl, Jesse, Scott, Tim, maybe a few others. But anyway, shout out to my colleagues from Arcadia. Sorry, I'm not with you in person, but at least we can see each other through Zoom right now. If we could advance to the next slide, it'd be great. So I'm borrowing here, obviously, from Paula Giddings. I thought it might be helpful to tell you when and where I enter this conversation today. We all come to this work with our personal narratives. We heard a little bit about that already today, and clearly it informs how we think and how we behave and how we think about the world around us. Next slide. So my story begins with my mother, as it does for most of us. She was the first in her family to leave India in the 1960s. She was incredibly ambitious. She didn't have a college degree, but had received the training necessary to practice nursing at the time. By the way, this is a pretty familiar narrative among women from Kerala, from Southwest India. And there's a great book called When Women Come First by Sheba George that traces this history. And I've written about it quite a bit too, of sort of nurse migration from India. My mother was part of that movement. She left Kerala, moved to Mumbai to practice nursing. She met my father in Mumbai. They had a love marriage, as our families called it at the time. Arranged marriages were still very popular. That's more of the norm. And when our families discovered that they were dating, they quickly got married. And my older brother was born. And my mother, shortly after he was born, said to my father in no uncertain terms that they were moving to America. If you talk to my father about this whole scenario, he was resistant, but my mother was a force. And eventually they did make their way to the US. They didn't have the resources for all of them to move together to the US. So my mother went ahead to pave the way for the rest of the family to join. Her first stop was actually Dubai. The picture on the right is her send-off from India as the first person in her family ever to leave the country. She had a friend of a friend who she knew in Dubai. She earned enough money in Dubai to make her way to Philadelphia and actually began practicing nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. It just so happened that there was a great demand for healthcare workers in America at the time. And with the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, she was able to come and literally serve the needs of the US economy, as were many immigrants from Asia and other parts of the world. Eventually, my father and my older brother joined her, and then I was born. I have trouble imagining what it must have been like for her to make that sacrifice of being apart from her family. Unfortunately, she passed away when I was about 10 years old. And it's a traumatic set of events that's for another conversation, but I'll say that for the purpose of this conversation, her legacy of ambition and courage shaped me profoundly, which is readily apparent in the themes that I will talk about today. Her role as a community leader in a helping profession, all of it certainly influenced my love for higher education. So the work I do, I would describe it as a calling. It's not a job. It's a passion. It's a life's work. And while I missed the classroom very much, about 15 years ago, I realized that to become an architect of campus life was a space where I could have great impact. I never intended to be a college president. It was never a career aspiration. My aspiration was simply to build a community where I could be my authentic self while helping others to do the same, a place where everyone's narrative, their strengths, their weaknesses, all could be embraced and accepted. And, this is essentially the work that I am doing as Arcadia's 22nd president. Next slide. So some assume that authenticity in leadership becomes easier if you are the boss, if you are the president. But I would argue that it's actually more difficult because I think the role of university president is so narrowly defined these days. But I am excited in my leadership role to reimagine it and present the 2.0 president for the Academy. And so I hope that frame helps you better understand when and where I kind of enter this conversation today. Next slide. But of course, in our leadership roles, we all hit stumbling blocks. And I'll say in recent years, in my own leadership role, I felt a sense of hopelessness for the first time. And even beyond the pandemic, thinking about the state of race relations, the state of the world, I felt like I was losing my mojo, so to speak. And like many of you, I work in education because of the optimism, the opportunity to dream, the opportunity to help community members realize their dreams. And in these moments of despair, I searched for ways to return to the idealism and optimism that I came to higher education with. So I would think back to something my parents would often say to me, and they would say, Shakti Vernam. In my native language of Malayalam, which is a South Indian dialect, it roughly means you need strength. Shakti also refers to the awakening of our consciousness, this kind of dynamic energy that flows through all of us and connects us. It helps us lead from the center, which is the central theme of my talk today. Next slide. So during the pandemic with Shakti, I re-engaged as a community leader, trying to serve as an agent of change to work towards justice. And I realized that part of our problem in society, as a society, was the need to reconcile what was happening in our inner worlds with the rest of the world, to move from a kind of egocentric path to a soul-centric path, to understand that all of our stories, that our souls are connected, as opposed to an egocentric path where we have a kind of limited obligation to one another. Next slide. So this led me to articulate a new paradigm for our communities that I think can help us lead from the center. And I hope you don't mind, but I'd love to test out these ideas with you today, and hopefully we can have some robust discussion about it. And so I'll offer up 5 principles for this community of practice, if you will, to help guide our work. And again, I hope you find it timely as we try to recalibrate in this new world that we've inherited. So let me start by trying to define a community of practice. A community of practice, in my mind, enacts shared values, passions, concerns, to learn together and to seek positive transformation. I think of communities of practice as regenerative. In other words, there will be inevitably moments when our community doesn't live up to our values, but we must be willing and able to show compassion and forgiveness and ultimately grow from the mistakes that we make. And I've been struck by how hard this is, even in college communities. We are so polarized at times. It can be so disheartening. But I hope some of these principles can help us, again, to recalibrate. Next slide. So my first principle is this notion of polyculturalism. Now, I've written a great deal about this, borrowed from ideas from Robin Kelly, Vijay Prashad, and others. But my life is actually a great example of this. My life was like an Indian version. I don't know if you remember the sitcom, Everybody Hates Chris. Imagine this scenario. It's a true scenario. It's 1983. I'm a 9-year-old boy. I'm perfecting my windmill, my popping techniques, and my flares. Yeah, someone who can, barely touch his toes now that stands before you today was a breakdancer and a hip hop aficionado. Fortunately, we are on Zoom, so it would just be too difficult for me to show you my skills, although I'm sure you're eager to see them. Nucleus has just released Jam On's Revenge and their follow-up single, Jam On It. We're one of the first Indian families to move into this predominantly white middle-class neighborhood from the city, from Southwest Philadelphia. We were moving on up. And as a kid, I wondered how I so quickly changed from Black to white, still stuck in a kind of racial binary, voiceless without my music from West and Southwest Philly to the burbs, all in a matter of a few years. Being brown, being Indian, being South Asian, it wasn't an option, or at least it wasn't an option in my town. I was Black in the eyes of my peers, and they were, up at the top of the food chain, and I felt like I needed to climb somehow as fast as I possibly could. So my predominantly white suburban school, I would carry my boom box during recess. I said it, boom box. I'm sure that brings back memories for some, and if it doesn't bring back memories for you, well, I feel incredibly old. I would bring together the Michael Jackson fans, the Run DMC fans, Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5 fans, and the three of us, I had a following of three. We would get together at recess, and we thought we were really very cool. And it was a little strange for all of my peers, I'll say. I like to say it wasn't easy growing up funny. It isn't easy being your authentic self because society has compartmentalized our identities. We've been put in boxes. Society has ignored the fluidity of our culture. Society has imposed dominant ideologies upon us that maintain power and privilege. So I argue today we must be willing and able to carry our own boombox, to be soul-centric, which I admit it isn't easy in our current climate. It's incredibly challenging in our current climate. It requires Shakti. So multiculturalism, in my opinion, now stands as a great fault line of our society. Melting pots, salad bowls, stews, whatever you want to call them, they no longer suffice. And we can't ignore the fluidity of the cultural boundaries, the porous nature of culture. We have to create a framework for diversity that recognizes that cultures are interrelated, that they draw from one another, that we all have multiple identities, and that the connection among all of us is deep, that it's historical, that it's valuable. Our students, too, shouldn't be required to live in a box like I was, compartmentalized by a set of characteristics that society has dictated to us. Next slide. Social justice then pays attention to the resources that individuals and communities bring to personal and social change. Inequities aren't solved by simply redistributing resources. Rather, the processes that facilitated the inequities to begin with must be evaluated and changed. So April 2nd, 2018, you heard that was my first day on the job at Arcadia, as my first day as university president. I opened up one of my many boxes scattered around my new office. I pulled out a picture of my family. I admired it for a moment. I placed it on my desk. I gazed out the window of my office, which, by the way, is actually in a historic castle. I kid you not. If you haven't been to Arcadia's campus, please visit. It's a beautiful campus. And then there was a knock on my door from my assistant. This is my first day. We didn't know each other very well at all. And she nervously said, "President Nair, I just want to let you know that there's a little protest on the green." By the way, a few hundred people doesn't qualify as a little protest. The protest was about a number of decisions that my predecessor had made, that I had inherited, related to budget cuts. So I got up out of my ergonomically sound chair and I started walking. And my assistant said, "Are you going somewhere? Can I help?" And I said, "I'm going to the protest." And she gave me a look of bewilderment. So I exited the castle with my assistant in tow. But something strange happened on the way to the protest. I noticed administrators watching the protest from afar. And one by one, my colleagues followed me to the protest, like soldiers ready to battle. And as we approached the green, the soldiers, the administrators, stopped and stood tall, awaiting instructions from their new general. I kept on going, oblivious that I had gathered troops on my journey from the castle to the green. I had joined the protest, curious and excited by the passion of my new community. And as I listened to the concerns about proposed cuts to the budget that I had inherited as a new leader, one by one, the protesters, my community members, thank me for coming and welcome me to the university. So instead of a big party that day, I had a protest. And the protest continued, and my soldiers, the administration, realized there was no enemy. Next slide, please. So the perceived enemy were university citizens who loved the university and wanted justice. We cannot do the work of justice if we ourselves do not lead in just ways. We must lead from the center and facilitate a social justice agenda. Next slide. So relatedly, we must struggle intellectually with our own value systems, our own beliefs. We must move beyond diversity and inclusion and tolerance and cultural competence and ultimately embrace cultural humility, to think about our own thinking, to engage in a kind of lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. And critics would say that we shouldn't provide safety to our students. They need to be challenged. They need to feel discomfort to grow and learn. And I actually agree. But the kind of safety that we need to provide isn't from ideas. It's from systemic injustice that isn't always visible, but it's nefarious and it's painful. We need to provide a learning environment that's free from the fear that many of our community members have, that many of us have lived with for a lifetime, fear of deportation, fear of a loved one or yourself being deported, fear of sexual assault, fear of police, fear of a cycle of poverty and despair, fear of gun violence. Unfortunately, many, many fears, right, that I can't articulate even during the course of this conversation today. Next slide. And so this idea of cultural humility goes hand in hand with open expression. How do we have the conversations no one wants to have? How do we create an environment where diversity of opinions are truly appreciated? Cultural humility is necessary to have these conversations. And unfortunately, we don't spend much energy on this topic because we are often distracted by issues of free speech. By the way, I am a firm believer in the notion of open expression. I think it's a slippery slope when people like me get to determine who speaks on our campus and who doesn't. But if we are willing to open up our campus to vile people, then shouldn't we do everything in our power to ensure that the foundation of student success is secure? In other words, that acts of intolerance become anomalies, not routine occurrences on our campuses and beyond. That when an act of hate occurs, it is so out of the ordinary that we are actually shocked. That's not how it feels on most college campuses. Most of us aren't shocked anymore because acts of hate are far too frequent. Next slide, please. And so the last principle of this community of practice is a sense of belonging. When I was at Emory University, now 6 years ago, at the start of the Black Lives Matters movement, a student who I knew well came to my office and asked me a seemingly simple question. Is the university serious about racial justice? And my immediate response was, yes, of course. But as I thought about her question, it was my sense that I had no real evidence that the institution was serious. I had no real evidence that higher education was serious. The student went on to explain why she cared so deeply. She said, imagine seeing Black bodies that look like you being killed on mainstream media every day. She said, I want to affect change in my community here on my campus. And with that, I engaged our community in a project based on some key questions that I think help us unpack an important aspect of the change agenda that I'm trying to drive. Next slide, please. So the questions are, what are the values and principles of community? If the values are simply aspirational, we have to question why. Why are the values not lived? And so, for instance, if you visit Arcadia or visit our website, we don't talk about aspirational values, we talk about lived values. Number two, how does power operate at a university or in your organization? If we begin to understand how power operates, we can use those same systems to affect positive change. Number three, what processes already work at the institution that can serve as a model? Clearly, there are models that have worked at all of our institutions on a variety of issues. I think we need to learn from these models and build from it to create this framework to affect change. And number four, how are we deploying resources? If there's a duplication of effort, if there are gaps in our strategy, is there a strategy around justice? If you have a strategic plan, where does justice fall into it? Is it number 10, number 20 on your list of priorities, or does it actually frame your strategy as it does at Arcadia? And number five, we must create best practice. If we know that what we've been doing has only had incremental or modest success, why wouldn't we experiment and innovate? Why wouldn't we create best practice? Next slide, please. My final thought is a reminder that we have an enormous privilege as educators. In Plato's Symposium, the ideal form of beauty is described as an everlasting loveliness, which neither comes nor goes, which neither flowers nor fades. In this way, education is more than a fleeting joy. Education provides a beautiful, eternal happiness, an eternal happiness that emerges from a community of practice that strives to be a reflection of the world that we want to live in. This is our calling. This is what I love about our work. We can strive for a utopian world, even while acknowledging and acting against that which is unjust. I've spent my entire career moving the margins closer to the center. Today, I'm suggesting that we must redefine the center and lead from it. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Nair. Oh my, yes, thank you so much. We are incredibly intrigued by what you have shared, particularly as we reflect upon our roles within the university domain, which is such a special place. It is such a special place that is bringing in students at a really vulnerable but powerful time in their lives. And so as you pose the question, how do we redefine the center by leading from the center? I invite all our colleagues here to keep that question in the front of your mind as you move into your breakout groups. And so Dr. Nair left us with some questions that will provide a great framing for our discussion, as well as those 5 concepts, those five building blocks of the community of practice that he speaks to. So just to reiterate those questions, he asked us, what are the values and principles of the community of practice that we're seeking to build at our universities? How does power operate at the university that either enables us to as he put it, bring the margins into the center, or does it perpetuate margins to stay at the periphery? The third question of what processes already work at the institution that could serve as a model. So what are we getting right? That may be something that enables us to scale or enhance our efforts. And then 4, how are we deploying resources, which is such a critical part of how power is distributed and how power dynamics are created. Those 5 concepts, again, of community of practice that he speaks to regarding leading from the center are polyculturalism, a justice agenda, cultural humility, impossible conversations, and sense of belonging.
Eliada, I think you did a better job summarizing than my actual talk, so thank you.
Dude, I was here just soaking it all in. So with all of that in our arsenal, with all of those really great concepts and frameworks in our pocket, Joelle, we're doing the do.
We're doing it. Thank you so much. And thank you for capturing that summary. You all can find those questions in the chat as well as those 5 concepts. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. If you have any troubles, please stay back in the main room and we can support you here.